Yeah, hello everybody. Thank you, Flavia, for the introduction. My name is Andrei Dumitrescu, and I'm a doctoral student at the University of Helsinki at the Doctoral Program for Language Studies. And the topic of my dissertation is Meglen Vlach grammar, about which you will hear soon something more. And I'm originally from Romania, but I've lived in Finland for more than half of my life. And well, I've been interested in languages ever since I was a kid. And I used to create my own imaginary languages when I was younger. Now I'm more interested in, so to say, real languages. Well, when I first moved to Finland, it was kind of also my first fieldwork experience, in the sense that I wanted to learn Finnish very well, and I had to adapt to a new culture and language. And so maybe that's something that may have shaped my career. And as a hobby, I'm into bird watching, which you might also notice a bit later in the presentation. So today I'm going to talk about writing grammars of languages, and specifically small endangered languages. These are the main topics I will touch today: linguistic diversity, meaning all the kinds of languages that we have in the world, grammar writing, and then linguistic typology, which is a branch of linguistics which deals with comparing different languages and looking at what structures are similar and different in them. And also a bit about language endangerment, which is the situation of, unfortunately, many languages today, that they might disappear at some points in the future. And first, if we think about the languages of the world, we all know that there are different languages, but actually, mostly we are aware of the tip of the iceberg, so to say, because most people speak one of the languages with most speakers. So there are maybe about 7,000 languages in the world. And so that means that the average number of speakers is about 1 million, but the median number is about 5,000. So most languages are spoken by few people. And yeah, Flavia already mentioned that to make this a bit more interactive, we are asking you to send us what your native language is, or your native languages if you grew up with two or three. You can write that in the links shared in the chat. It's in Mentimeter, and then at the end of the presentation, we'll look at the results and see what languages we have present right here. Now, before going into diversity, I want to think a bit about what language actually is. So in a very simple way, we can illustrate it like this. So there is a word in English, a bird, and then it refers to some kind of a concept that we have. So there's an association between sound and meaning. And then it is actually, the concept is actually a kind of category. So it categorizes the world into things that are bird and things that are not bird. Now, if we think about grammar, in a way, grammatical concepts function in a similar way. So if we think about the English plural form, birds, or whatever plural form of a noun that we have in English, it refers to a situation where there is more than one of a kind. But it can also refer to several different real-world situations. So it is also in a category, in a sense. Now, let's go to linguistic diversity. So maybe the first thing that comes to mind is that different languages have different words for the same thing. So for instance, bird is lintu in Finnish and vogel in Swedish, and so on. And another point is that different languages have different sounds. So for example, in Hungarian, bird is madár, which has a short vowel and then a long vowel, but then not all languages have an opposition between short and long vowels. And then in Mandarin Chinese, bird is niao, which has a tone. And so the pitch in which you say the word matters. If you change it, you change the meaning of the word. And besides the differences in vocabulary, we also have differences in grammar, and that's what we're mostly interested in today. So just as an example, many languages have singular and plural like English, but they don't form it in the same way. So in English, you have normally a suffix s, but then, for example, in Swahili, you have a prefix that you put at the beginning of the word. So one orange is chungwa, but more oranges is machungwa. Then you can also have a situation where the stem, so the body of the word is changed itself, as in English, goose in singular, geese in plural. And in Skoltsami, which is a language spoken in northern Finland and which has about 300 speakers, this is so stem change is the main strategy to form plurals. Then in Hawaiian, for instance, you have a plural word. So in the example, i'a is fish and maui'a is, well, many fish. And in Indonesian, you have reduplication. So rumah is house, rumah is houses. So this is the kind of thing that linguistic typology is interested in, looking at languages and seeing like what kind of different structures there are in the world. And also it is interested in seeing which structures are more common and whether there is any geographical distribution to them. So if we want to make a typological study, first we have to read a lot of grammar books, and well, they will have something to say about plurals for sure. And then we decide on the categories that we want to include in the study. So the things that we just looked at, so we can find several languages which have the same strategy, as in most European languages actually use a suffix for most plurals. And then we can also put this on a map. And here I have taken the colors from a typological study by Dreyer. You can see the colors on the left-hand side. So suffix is blue, prefix is red, and so forth. And then this is the map that we get. He used, so Dreyer used a sample of 1,000 languages, which is quite large for a typological study, but usually have a few hundred languages. And here we can see that most let's say half of languages use a suffix. Other languages use different strategies, and we can also see that there's a geographical distribution in that most of Europe and Northern Asia has suffixes. A large part of Africa has prefixes, and then in this area we don't have so many prefixes, but mostly plural words, or even like no plural forms at all. And to zoom in, so there are a few areas where you can see the dots like overlap to a large extent. So for example, Papua New Guinea is a country which has a huge diversity of languages. It's called a diversity hotspot. Altogether, there are maybe 800, more than 800 languages there. So in this study, it's only a fraction of them, but we can already see that these languages differ in terms of plural formation, almost in the same way that all the languages in the world. We can find all the possible diversity here already. And one more point that I would like to emphasize is that, well, some people may think that people living in so-called tribal conditions in the jungle are more primitive and they have less technology, less complex cultures. But at least in linguistics, it's very clear that their languages are just as complex as any other language. And if you write a grammar about a Papuan language, it's going to be as complex, as large of a work as any other language. Right. Now, we have looked at ways to form plural, but this is formal matter. So this is a question of how things are formed in a grammar. But then there is also diversity in meaning of grammatical categories in the languages of the world. And as an example, in Mansi, which is a Uralic language distantly related to Finnish, there are 3 number categories. So there is singular, there is plural, but there is also dual, which means exactly 2. So if you want to say 2 horses, you say luvig, and that's also formed with a suffix. And then I'll just go back to this study. So, or maybe here, in this study, you also notice that there are languages which don't have the category of singular and plural at all for nouns, such as Cantonese. So the idea here is that languages will divide up the world and human experience in different ways, and that includes the grammar as well. So in a way, each language is its own unique window to reality and to human cognition. So to sum up, until here, we've seen that there is linguistic diversity or different languages in the world, and linguists write grammars about them, and then typologists use those grammars to make cross-linguistic studies. Now let's look a bit into language endangerment. And here's a map of endangered languages throughout the world. This map contains a bit over 3,000 languages, so about half of all the languages in the world. And well, estimating how endangered a language is not easy because, you know, it's about predicting the future, basically. But there are several scales in use, and they pay attention to things like how many speakers the language has, whether there is transmission of the language from one generation to the next. So it may be that only part of the children of the speakers are actually learning the language, and others are switching to a different language. And also the level of governmental and official educational support. And in this map, darker red is more endangered and orange is less endangered, and then black is extinct. So there are already quite a few languages in the world which have gone extinct recently in the last decades. And this has happened mostly as a result of people deciding that to switch to a different language. And as you can see, there are several hotspots of linguistic diversity and endangerment in the world. Most of them are in the tropics, as in the Amazonian basin and Papua New Guinea and surrounding islands, but also the Himalayan foothills and, well, the Sahel region. So what are linguists doing about this situation? Of course, first of all, we would like to know what these languages are like. And because they are disappearing little by little, it's very important to document as much as possible, as soon as possible. And other reasons for working with endangered languages is, first of all, those languages are often marginalized, so they have no government support, and they are not taught in schools. And it may be that their speakers are discriminated in one way or another. So writing a grammar is one small part of helping increase the status of that community. And also, if that community decides to create an orthography and a standard language for their language, then having a grammar is a first step in that. And then even if the language is disappearing right now, it may be that the descendants of the current speakers will decide to revitalize the language and start speaking it again. So having a description of the language and the grammar is essential for revitalizing. These are reasons which concern the community, but then there are also, so to say, scientific reasons. Of course, as linguists, we want to have data about what languages are like, and one purpose of typology is to find out what is a possible human language, what is all the variation that exists in the languages of the world. And beyond that, studying languages can also be useful in anthropology and cognitive science and so on. And then to add a more personal touch, I am personally interested in doing my doctoral studies in this topic, also because it's an intellectual challenge, and among other things because I'm interested in language contact, and the language I chose, Meglen Vlach, is spoken in the Balkan Peninsula, where historically there has been a lot of contact between different languages. And if we now look at how this is actually done in practice, here is a summary of the grammar writing process. You choose a language, you go to the area where it is spoken, and then you find language consultants, so people whom you can ask questions about that language. You record them, and then you come back home and transcribe the recordings, analyze them, and then write the grammar. Okay, sounds pretty easy, right? So let's look in more detail at each step. The language I'm studying is called Meglen Vlach, or also Megleno-Romanian. It's actually closely related to Romanian. But it has only about 5,000 speakers. And it was originally spoken in that area on the border between Greece and North Macedonia, which you can see on the map. But now there are also speakers in Romania, Turkey, and other countries. And it's a Romance language, so originally derived from Latin. And it's very endangered, meaning most children of the speaker communities don't learn the language anymore. So the oldest people who can speak fluently are probably in their 50s. And the reasons for this situation are manifold. For once, there were many wars in the area in the first half of the 20th century. People had to run away. Because of that, then the language doesn't have any official recognition, and it is not taught in schools. And also the economic situation in that area was poor, so many people moved away. And so I did field work in Greece in a village called Archangelos last autumn, and this is what it looks like there. So I spent 2 weeks there, and I tried to get to know people, just walking around and talking to people who are sitting on the terraces of restaurants or in other places. It's very nice that people there are quite open, so it's easy to strike up a conversation and tell them what I'm up to, but it's not necessarily very easy to find somebody who is interested to work with me and spend like a lot of time explaining and allowing me to record them. Anyway, I found a few informants or consultants, as they're called, and here's a picture of me working with one. And what you do with them is like, you can record them talking so they can tell you stories, or if you have a couple, you can record conversations, and that's very useful because, for instance, if you want to find out how questions are formed, you won't have them in stories. And then you can also have more focused sessions of work with consultants where you decide like what you want them to tell you. So you can have a list of sentences that you want them to translate into their own language. And this may be useful, but it's also a bit dangerous because, for example, in my situation, I used both Meglen Vlach and Greek to speak with them. But if I wanted them to translate sentences from Greek to Meglen Vlach, there might be interference from Greek, so I would not get like the best form of the language. And then there are also, so to say, nonverbal stimuli that you can use to help to make informants talk about certain things. For example, pictures, videos, and so on. Now, you have to be careful what you do because you have to think of concrete situations because they might not be used to linguists thinking abstractly about languages. So if you want to ask a sentence that doesn't make sense, even if it's grammatically correct, they might say it doesn't make sense. We cannot say that. Like once I asked how to say, like, how do you say to the horse jumps off the table? And they said, no, that's not possible. The horse is too big. And then another good way in which consultants can help you is by telling you whether a sentence is grammatical or not. So for example, in English, if you want to know what verb form comes after a noun, depending on whether it's singular or plural, you ask like the bird, can you say the bird is flying? And they say yes. And then you ask, can you say the birds is flying? And if you haven't explained to them exactly what you want, they might also say yes, because they think, okay, this poor guy has traveled all the way here to learn our language and he's making a good effort. So I'm not going to nitpick about every mistake he makes. Right. Here is an example of toys that we used in a different field trip in South Africa together with Heini Aryava, studying a language called Isindebele. So we were studying spatial relations, and we showed these toys to informants, and they would say, for example, the girl is sitting in front of the house, or the lion is prowling behind the bushes, and so forth. And then once you get back home, you have the recordings, and what you do with them is you transcribe them. And what many linguists use is a program called PRAT, where you can see well, the sound wave and the spectrogram, and then you use the International Phonetic Alphabet usually to transcribe the words. And after that, you look at the data you have and try to figure out how it works. And this is a back and forth process that takes a long time. You ask informants, what does this word mean? And then they explain, and then you listen at home to the explanation, and then you hear some grammatical form that you still don't understand, so you go back to the field and ask them again, and so forth. But eventually you figure out how to understand the language. Actually, like learning to speak the language and communicating with people in real world situation is probably the best way to understand how it works. And here is where typology comes in handy. So let's say I have these words in Meglen Vlach, like laf is a word, and lafur is the plural form, words. So here you can see there's a suffix, but then the next word, yed, is a goat kid, and in plural it's yes. So here we have a stem change. And then in the word for elbow, we have both the suffix and the stem change. And of course, this is a simple example. But in general, if you read typological studies, then you understand what kind of variation there is in the world's languages in both form and meaning. And then you know kind of what to expect from a language, even though you've never heard it before. And of course, that's very useful, but as I said, like every language is kind of a unique combination of all these features, so you might always find some new surprises. And of course, in my case, as a speaker of Romanian, Meglen Vlach is not so different from my mother tongue, so I have a good position to start, but in principle, this is how fieldwork works. So to conclude, here is summary of my talk. We have different languages in the world, and we do fieldwork to write grammars about them, and also to document them in other ways. Then we use the data in grammars to make typological studies. And from those studies, we get the theory that is useful for grammar writing. So that's a back and forth process. And the more grammars are written, the easier it is for the following scientists to write them. And then grammar writing is one small part of language revitalization. Of course, I'm not imagining that I am personally saving the language, but in practice, it is the community of speakers who decides what happens to it. Ultimately, they are the ones who can keep the language alive by speaking it.